Hello and welcome in this first podcast of the summary for the course of History of English Literature. First part. Let's start off with the first chapter, the Old English period, with a first point, historical background, and the first subpoint, the Anglo-Saxon invasions. The Anglo-Saxon invaders, called like this because two of the main tribes were the Angles and the Saxons, came to Britain in the latter part of the 5th century, after the Romans had left the country unprotected. The Jutes settled mainly along the south coast, the Angles settled in the east and in the North Midlands, and the Saxons settled between the Angles and the Jutes, in a band of land from the Thames estuary westwards. Let's then go to the next subpoint, Christianization. This is the conversion of these tribes, who had by then settled in England, to Christianity. In 597, Pope Gregory the Great sent a monk called Augustine from Rome to re-establish Christianity in England. Several ruling families in England accepted Christianity, but monks made little progress with ordinary people. This was partly because Augustine was interested in establishing Christian authority, and that meant bringing rulers to the new faith. It was the Celtic Christian Church which brought Christianity to the ordinary people of Britain. The Celtic and Roman churches had starkly different approaches. One was more interested in the hearts of ordinary people, and the other in authority. At the end of the 8th century and the 9th century, the Anglo-Saxons in their turn had to face the invasions of the Vikings from Norway and Denmark. The Danes were defeated in 878 by a union of the little kingdoms of the south of England formed by the King of Wessex, Alfred the Great, 848 to 899. He Christianized them, and they gradually mixed with the local population. The Danish invasions started anew in the 10th and early 11th centuries. One of their leaders even became a king of England, Canute, or Knut, who reigned until 1035. Canute worked hard to unite his Danish and Saxon people. He also developed trading links with the continent. He was the king of Norway and Denmark as well. As in much of Western Europe at the time, two ways of life and thought gradually merged, namely the Germanic and Christian traditions. Most of the literature of the Anglo-Saxon period is associated with these two main trends of thought. Old English literature begins with poetry, not with prose. The earlier texts were based on a tradition of oral poetry, brought over by the Germanic invaders. This oral poetry was later written down by clerics. After that first point about historical background, let's go to the second one, Old English poetry, with a first subpoint, secular poetry. And let's first quickly talk about heroic poetry. Old English heroic poetry is in fact the nearest we can get to the oral tradition of the heroic ages of Germania. Poems were recited by the gleemen, or jongleurs. Most of the time, these poems, that were practically always set to music, were intended for an aristocratic audience. Old English verse is alliterative and stressed with no rhyme. That means that each line contains 4 stressed syllables and 2 or 3 alliterations, repetition of initial consonant, plus a varying number of unstressed syllables. There's a definite pause, caesura, between the 2 halves of each line, with 2 stresses on each side of the caesura. None of those early texts refer to local British heroes. They take us to continental Europe, or to Scandinavia, as in Beowulf. And next subpoint, let's talk about that, Beowulf. First half of the 8th century. The greatest Old English poem, Beowulf, is a story of over 3,000 lines. It is the only surviving manuscript of this sort, that is, of a long epic and narrative poem dealing with a traditional Germanic theme, and at the same time giving a picture of the culture and society of the heroic age of the Germanic people. Although the poem was written down in England, it speaks of the period of Germanic history before the Anglo-Saxons settled down in England. It is a good example of the combination of heroic idealism and the sombre fatalism, which seems to have been part of the Germanic temper. Beowulf is a mixture of historical and marvelous elements. There are also many discussions and allusions which make it clear that the poet relied on the listener's knowledge of a whole body of stories concerning other Germanic heroes. Beowulf is a heroic poem celebrating the exploits of a great warrior, whose character and actions are held up as a model of aristocratic virtue for all. One might note similarities with the great classical epic poems, such as Homer's Odyssey. Yet, there are also Christian intrusions in this pagan poem, introduced by the clerics who wrote it down in England after the Christianization of the country. However, these intrusions do not weaken the pagan spirit of the poem, for they mention only very general Christian notions. In terms of technique, the poem is written in stressed alliterative lines, with no rhyme. The poet uses extensive vocabulary, introducing what is called picture names, that is, a kind of poetic metaphor visually describing things and people. The sea thus becomes the swan's throat, and the body becomes the bone's house. Only two other texts, Finnsburg and Walther, belong to the same early epic tradition, and we only have badly corrupted fragments of them. After Beowulf, let's briefly talk about Widsith, the Far Wanderer. The text of Widsith must date back to the end of the 7th century, or the early 8th century, that is, after the Christianization of England. But the story existed in its oral form before that. It is partly the autobiographical record of an itinerant Scop. The poem reflects a world of wanderings and conquests. After Widsith, let's go to the next subpoint, Dior, 9th or 10th century. It is a short poem of 42 lines, divided into 7 unequal sections, expressing the complaint of a scoop who, after years of service with his lord, seems to have fallen out of favour, and to have been supplanted by a rival. He consoles himself by narrating the past misfortunes of Germanic heroes, who eventually overcame the difficulties. This poem is interesting because beside the usual interest in heroic deeds, it also contains a personal elegiac note, that is, a note of nostalgia or lament. And let's talk just about that, elegiac poetry. The poem considered in the sections are pagan Germanic narrative, although not heroic, poems, which are not so much a celebration of heroic deeds, as a melancholy expression of regret for a lost happy past, mixed with a measure of self-pity. There are 2 poems which are probably as old as Beowulf, 8th century, and which are characterized by vague Christian intrusions. They both end on a conventional religious sentiment, because they were written down in England after the beginning of its Christianization, the Wanderer and the Seafarer. There are also a number of narrative poems which contain an elegiac note, but without any Christian intrusions, such as The Rune. The last 2 poems illustrating this current of elegiac poetry are both dramatic monologues, containing the only traces of love to be found in Anglo-Saxon poetry. However, these poems are not truly lyrical. They are first and foremost narrative poems, intent on telling a story, the wife's lament, and the husband's message. After that elegiac poetry, let's talk about riddles. Another kind of secular poetry is to be found in the 100 Anglo-Saxon riddles, enigmas, which were composed in England by clerics of the 7th and 8th centuries. Some of them are translations from a Latin original. These riddles were a literary amusement of the time for the aristocracy. And after riddles, let's shortly talk about gnomic verse. They deal with generalizations about morals and experience, and with the properties of objects encountered in daily life. They are the only group of Anglo-Saxon poems which are not aristocratic in origin. And this is the end of that subpoint about secular poetry. Let's talk about the next subpoint, religious poetry. The Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons had more important effects on their literature than just the addition of Christian elements to heroic and elegiac narrative poems. By the 8th century, the techniques of Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry were applied to purely Christian themes. The Christian missionaries saw that they could not simply eradicate the old heroic tradition. So, in their efforts to impose Christianity, they expressed the new subject matter, that is, biblical stories, in the old way. Two names are connected with this religious poetry, Caedmon and Cinewulf. There are 4 Caedmonian poems, 3 of which are based on the Old Testament story. The first is Genesis A, 3,000 lines. This poem tells the substance of the first 22 chapters of Genesis. Second poem, Exodus, 8th century. In this poem, the influence of Germanic heroic poetry is clearly felt. The biblical narrative is followed less strictly than in Genesis A. And third poem, Christ and Satan. In this poem, the poet works not directly from biblical sources, but from a variety of Christian traditions. And that's the end of that second point about Old English poetry. Point 3. Old English prose. The development of prose does not go back to earlier Germanic origins, as that of poetry does. It takes place wholly in England, and largely as a result of Christianization. First point, Anglo-Latin prose. This section refers to prose works written in Latin in England. In the Middle Ages, Latin was the language of learning, of philosophy, theology, of the church and of all the religious scholars, who lived and studied in monasteries and abbey houses, which were the centers of learning at the time, before the universities were created. The Venerable Bede, 673 to 735, was one of these scholars. He gained a European reputation with his famous ecclesiastical history of the English race, which he wrote in Latin and completed in 731. For this, he has been called the father of English history. The work is considered a masterpiece, and much of what we know about English society at the time is due to Bede. After Anglo-Latin prose, let's talk about Old English secular prose. Roughly speaking, English prose begins under the reign of King Alfred, in an attempt by the king and his associates to make important aspects of earlier thought accessible to the governing class and the clergy, whose education suffered under the Danish invasions. Alfred achieved this by translating work from Latin into the vernacular. Alfred's translations from Latin include his translation of Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Rule as a manual for the instruction of the clergy. In order to get his people and the clergy to know the religious history and organization of their country, He also translated Bede, Ecclesiastical History of the English Race. Alfred's own contribution to English prose, not through his translations but through his historical works, is an important phenomenon in itself, because prose is the best medium for writing history. It is more accurate or precise than poetry, and thanks to Alfred's example, the English were the first in Europe to use prose rather than poetry for writing historical writings. It is under his authority that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was begun. It is a history compiled by monks at different centres and at different periods, which presents an outline of English history from the time of Julius Caesar's invasion to the middle of the 5th century. Beside its historical interest, the Chronicle is interesting because it shows the development of the language from Old to Middle English. And finally, last subpoint, religious prose. Ælfric, end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century, wrote homilies and lives of saints. He is also the first translator of the first 7 chapters of the Old Testament into Old English. Another religious prose writer of the same period was the Archbishop of York, Wulfstan, who wrote sermons in a fiery and passionate prose style. Next chapter, the Middle English period, 1066 to 1485. First point, historical background. The Norman conquest was the last in a series of migrations which put an end to the Roman Empire and brought into being a new medieval Europe. Christian values and practices established themselves more domineeringly. The social structure was altered, the literature changed accordingly. The heroic age was replaced by a feudal society. It was based on the ownership of land and on strictly defined bonds between social strata. It introduced new conventions of service, honor, and obligation of vassals to their lords. With the crowning of William the Conqueror in 1066, a Norman dynasty was established in England, which would last until 1154. Then the Plantagenet dynasty would occupy the throne until 1485, a date which marks the end of the Middle English period. The 100 Years' War opposed England to France from the mid-14th century to the mid-15th century. It is during this period that the English peasants' revolt took place in 1381. In 1422, Henry VI became the King of France, and Joan of Arc was burnt at the stake in 1431. The 15th century was a period of transition in England, and this is clear in both the political and the economic fields. The year 1455 marked the beginning of the War of the Roses between the House of York and Lancaster, which ended in 1485. During the war, the nobility had destroyed each other, which contributed to the rise of the middle class. The development of international trade that accompanied the Crusades also boosted the importance of the merchant class. Printing was introduced in England in 1476 by William Caxton, who printed not only the works of other writers but also books from other countries translated by himself into excellent English prose. As a result, a new class of readers was slowly developing. Also, information started circulating more freely. The new movement of humanism, which started in Italy in the 14th century, was beginning to awaken interest in England. The result of the Norman conquest was the establishment of a new French-speaking aristocracy in England. The Normans occupied all the important positions in the state and in the church, and Norman French became the language of the governing classes. while Anglo-Saxon, now developing into Middle English, naturally continued to be spoken by the majority of people. The court being French, there was a literature written in French by Anglo-Norman poets. This literature reached a climax under the reign of Henry II, 1154 to 1189, the first Plantagenet and great-grandson of William the Conqueror. In 1204, Normandy was lost to the English, and as a result, the connection between the Anglo-Normans and the French aristocracy in France was broken. French speakers living in England gradually blended with English-speaking subjects to form only one people. In other words, the break with France favored the recovery of the English language, which was now used in all circles, even though many French words were introduced into English. By the beginning of the 14th century, English has reasserted itself as the language of literature in England. One can distinguish three phases in the use of language in the Middle English period, which will determine the development of English literature. First one, up to 1250, poetry meant for the entertainment of the aristocracy and the court was written, while the English language was only used by the clergy in works intended for the common people. Second phase, after 1250, there is a more varied literature in English, including both religious and secular works. After 1350, English was used by everyone. In the 12th century, French poetry was more advanced than English poetry. The old alliterative verse was largely replaced by the French syllabic and rhymic verse. On the other hand, Anglo-Saxon prose had become much more advanced than anything in French prose. Simultaneously, the tradition of Anglo-Latin literature continued to develop. Latin was the learned language of the Christian world in the Middle Ages and was used for all official documents. After that first point of historical background, let's go to the second point, Middle English prose. Anglo-Saxon prose held a remarkable position among European literatures at the beginning of the Middle English period. They were translations from Latin, homilies, didactic and devotional religious work, and most importantly, historical writings. As far as historical writings are concerned, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles started by King Alfred in the 9th century came to an end in 1154. Latin and French verse was then used for historical records, as was the tradition in France. And English historical prose would only re-emerge under the Tudors in the early 16th century. After the conquest, English prose continued to be used by the clergy to instruct the common people in religious matters. These religious prose works in English thus ensured the continuity and the survival of English prose during this period, and up to the 15th and 16th centuries, when there would be a revival of prose in English. Let's talk about a brief subpoint: early religious prose in English. The Catherine group is the name given to 5 Middle English works of devotional prose, 3 of which focus on the lives of a virgin saint. They were addressed to a female audience and exalted the joys of convent life. Uncreaned Wise, also called Uncreaned While, is a book of devotional advice written by a chaplain in about 1230. It is the greatest prose work of the early Middle English period. The interest of this work today lies in the author's use of proverbs, anecdotes, character sketches, and realistic details of all kinds. There are also many references to matters of daily life. This makes the work an important document about the time, with human interest added to it. Next subpoint: later religious prose works. In the 14th century, religious prose works were no longer didactic only. Some were written by great contemplative mystical writers, like Richard Rolle of Hampole, circa 1300 to 1349, and his followers. The Cloud of Unknowing is one of the most admired products of the Middle English mystical tradition, and dates from the second half of the 14th century. Its author was presumably a priest, though not certain identification of him has been possible. Julian of Norwich, who was turned into a saint by the Catholic Church, wrote slightly later, towards the end of the 14th century, but in the same mystical vein. On the other hand, there is the work of John Wycliffe, possibly 1320 to 1384, who was very different from the members of the Rolle group. Wycliffe was a controversialist philosopher and a reformer who attacked some of the claims and practices of the Church. He considered that the Church had become too worldly, and he urged the king to take back the possessions of the Church and to restore the clergy to their original poverty. Wycliffe insisted on the absolute authority of the Bible in all questions concerning man's moral and spiritual life. And, last subpoint, more prose works. A 14th century French writer wrote The Travels of Sir John de Mandeville, which is a work of fiction or compilation from narratives by other travellers, but one that claims to be an account of genuine journeys written by Mandeville himself, when he, in fact, never existed and the author of the work never set foot away from home. The work was translated into English in 1377, became very popular, and was long regarded as genuine. John Trevisa's translations are also worth mentioning. He translated many medieval Latin works into vernacular and used an ornate prose which shows a certain degree of conscious artistry. This is why he can be seen to prefigure the sophistication and the sense of balance in prose style that will later be found at the time of the Renaissance. Prose works in the Middle English period are important because they helped to maintain a certain standard of English prose alive. From its astonishing early beginnings, through the difficult period, when the very existence of English prose was threatened by the predominance of French verse, up to the late 15th century. And this is the end of that first podcast of the summary for the course of History of English Literature, first part. I hope to see you back in the second one.